and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing, and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man.
Postman Pat Gets a Pet. Every day, Postman Pat sets out with his good cat Jess by his side. But there was a time, a long time ago, when Pat had no cat. He was alone in his red van, and he had no Jess to talk to as he drove along. It all began with the white mice. Every Saturday, Pat and Sarah and Julian go to Pencaster Market in the Greendale bus to do their shopping. One Saturday was busier than ever. There was such a lot of shopping to do. Pat and Sarah filled their bags and baskets with potatoes and onions and oranges and sprouts and lettuces and cheese.
"Could you hold the carrots, Julian?" said Sarah.
"Could you hold the apples and grapefruit, Julian?" said Pat. Julian's arms were full of shopping, and he thought it would never end. He was so tired. There was a long queue at the butcher's and another at the fish shop. Sarah and Pat looked in every shop and stopped to talk to all their friends.
"Oh, come on," said Julian. "Be patient," said Sarah.
They walked past the toy shop full of trains and planes and dolls. They walked past a shop full of radios and cassette players. They did not stop. Then they did stop to talk to Miss Hubbard.
"Look," said Julian.
They had stopped outside the pet shop. There in the window was a cage full of white mice. One of the mice was looking out at Julian and twitching its whiskers.
"A little white mouse," said Julian. "I'd love a little white mouse."
"Oh," said Pat, "I'm not sure I like mice."
"I always wanted one when I was little," said Sarah. "But my mum would never let me." "I'd love a mouse," said Julian. "You need 2 or 3 to keep each other company," said Sarah. "Well, we'll go in and look at them."
Sarah and Julian went in the pet shop. Pat stayed outside, talking to Miss Hubbard. or at least listening to her. He was saying goodbye to Miss Hubbard just as Julian and Sarah came out again, carrying a cage with 4 mice in it. "What have you got there?" said Pat.
"Mini tigers," said Sarah. "Aren't they lovely?" said Julian.
Said Pat, "I'm not too sure. Ouch!" He had poked his finger between the bars of the cage, and a little brown mouse gave it a good nip.
"You frightened it," said Sarah. "That's why it bit you. They have to get used to you."
"I don't think I'll get used to it," said Pat.
"What shall we call them?" said Julian.
"You can call that one Nipper," said Pat.
"And the white ones are Bess and Bill," said Julian. "And the black and white ones, Jess," said Sarah.
It was soon time to catch the bus home to Greendale. Many of their friends were on the bus with their bags of shopping. They saw Miss Hubbard and Granny Dryden and all the Thompsons. The Reverend Timms jumped in just as the bus was getting ready to start. "Can't be bothered with the old car on Saturdays," he said. "There's just nowhere to park. Hello, what have you got there? White mice? Bless me, I had some white mice when I was a boy. What a lovely present." All went well until Julian put the cage of mice on the seat beside him and looked out of the window to wave at Peter Fogg on his tractor. When he looked back at the mice, there was Nipper sitting on top of the cage, looking all about him with great interest. He had never seen a bus before, and meant to find out all about it.
"Dad," said Julian. "Quick, one's got out."
Pat stretched his hand out. Sarah pulled it back.
"You don't want another bite," she said. "I'll get my gloves on, then I can pick it up."
But before she could do anything, Nipper jumped off the cage, ran along the seat, up the back and over, and jumped into Dorothy Thompson's lap. She screamed,
"Oh, a mouse! Oh, a mouse! Help!"
and she jumped up, shaking Nipper off her coat and onto the floor. Now it ran between the Reverend's legs. He tried to catch it, but it was too quick for him. It was away along the length of the bus, making people jump and squeal as it tickled their feet. The driver stopped the bus in a lay-by to see what the trouble was, and joined in the hunt for the mouse. Everyone tried to catch that little mouse, and whilst they were busy, the other 3 squeezed out between the bars of the cage and ran for freedom. What a rumption there was in the Greendale bus that day. Some people were creeping about on their hands and knees looking for the mice and shouting to each other, whilst others sat with their feet tucked up on the seats out of the way of mouse nips. It was the Reverend Timms who put things to rights in the end. He said in his best church voice, "Dear friends, if you will all sit still and quiet, I'll catch those mice in a trice. I kept mice as a boy, and I know what to do." At the sound of his voice, everyone calmed down and sat quietly. The Reverend borrowed a plastic bucket that Granny Dryden had bought in the market, and some crumbs of cake from Miss Hubbard. He put the cake in the bucket and the bucket on the floor, sideways, and waited. Everyone sat still. You would have thought there was no one in that bus. It was so quiet. But you could hear a scurrying and a scratching as the 4 mice explored the bus, and then a patter-patter sound when they found the bucket, and their little paws tapped on the smooth plastic. Then a tiny munching sound as they ate the cake. The Reverend picked up the bucket and held it the right way up. There were the 4 little mice in the bottom of the bucket, and no matter what they did, they could not get out again. The plastic was too slippery for them to climb. Granny Dryden said they could borrow her bucket if they gave it a good washing out afterwards. "It's no good you putting them back in that cage," she said. "They'll only get out again." So the mice had to live in the bucket for a day or two until Pat could think what to do. When Mrs. Goggins heard about the trouble with the mice, she said,
"If you get a bigger pet, it won't squeeze between the bars. Why don't you get a hamster? They're lovely. There were some folks on holiday last summer. They had one and it was a real beauty. They used to bring it in to show me. It never bit anyone, and the little girl loved it."
So Pat asked Julian, and he said,
"All right."
and Pat caught the bus to Pencaster on Tuesday afternoon with the cage and the bucket of mice, and came back with a hamster in the cage and the empty bucket. The hamster didn't bite, and Julian was quite fond of it. All went well until the day he said,
"The poor thing must get tired of being in that cage all the time and running round and round in that wheel. Do you think we could let it out for a run round the carpet?"
It seemed such a quiet creature, and so sweet-tempered, that Sarah said,
"Well, I'm sure it wouldn't do any harm to let it out for a little while, if you keep your eye on it. It's too big to go down a mouse hole."
But the hamster went behind the settee and wouldn't come out. And when Sarah and Julian moved the settee away from the wall, there was no sign of the hamster. And when Pat came home, there was no tea ready, and Sarah and Julian were creeping about all over the house, looking for the hamster and calling to it. But there was neither sight nor sound of it. Then Pat said, "What's this hole under the settee?" And Sarah said,
"What hole?" "Oh."
And they saw the teeth marks all round the hole, and they knew who had made them. Then Pat took the back off the settee to see if the hamster was inside. There was a pile of sawdust, where the hamster had been nibbling, but no hamster. Then Julian looked behind the television set and saw a hole in the skirting board, and Pat moved the television so that they could see it properly. When Alf called in to borrow a bag of sugar, they showed him the hole. "That's a hamster hole, all right," he said. "They love gnawing wood. It's in their nature. It'll be right under the floor now, nibbling away to its heart's content. You'll have to have the floor up. You'll never get it out. It'll have the floor caved in after a time."
"Oh dear," said Sarah. "That'll never do. It'll cost a fortune."
"You ought to get a dog," said Alf. "They make the best pet you can have, and they're useful for getting sheep in." "We haven't got any sheep," said Pat. "No, but you've got a hamster," said Alf. "Perhaps our Towser could get it out." He brought his little dog in. It snuffled at the hole and wagged its tail like mad, but it couldn't get the hamster out. But Pat had an idea. "I'll catch the hamster," he said. "You'll never get it in a bucket," said Alf. "No, but I bet you I can still get it," said Pat. That night, after Julian had gone to bed, Pat got his old baby bath out and put it near the hole the hamster had made. He put some hamster food in the empty bath. Then he found a long piece of wood and leaned it against the bath. The wood made a path up to the edge of the bath. The sides of the bath were high and slippery.
"Are you thinking of giving that hamster a bath?" said Sarah.
"It might need one," said Pat. "But it must be getting hungry. When we've gone to bed, it's sure to come out." The idea is that it will walk up the wood, jump in the bath for the food, and not be able to climb out again, up the slippery sides.
"It's not as daft as that," said Sarah. "It'll never work. Hamsters have more brains than mice."
When Pat went to bed, he lay awake in the dark. When all the house was quiet, There was, Pat felt sure, a tiny sound of little paws and nibbling teeth. Pat crept downstairs with his torch. There, in the empty bath, sat a rather dusty hamster, blinking in the light. On Wednesday afternoon, Pat took the hamster back to Pencaster in its cage and came back with a large sheepdog. Julian called the dog Bess, after one of the mice. He loved her. She was a very lively dog and had to go for a long walk every day. She never sat still. When Pat was out with his letters and Julian was at school, Sarah and Bess walked the hills all over Greendale. Then Sarah got a job in the council office in Pencaster. What would happen to Bess? "She'll have to come with me in my van," said Pat. But oh dear, Bess was hopeless in Pat's van. She wouldn't stay in her basket. One day she chewed the corner of a parcel. She jumped out and chased hens. She ran off looking for sheep to round up. And it took Pat an hour to find her. She even followed Pat and growled at Miss Hubbard when she came out for a parcel.
"Well," said Miss Hubbard, "I've heard of postmen being chased by dogs, but never t'other way round," as Pat shooed Bess back to the van. "That dog needs training, Pat."
"You're right," said Pat, "and I've no notion about how to do it."
"Colonel Forbes is on the lookout for another sheepdog," said Miss Hubbard, "and he's a dab hand at training dogs. He'd soon get her into shape. Why don't you have a word with him?"
"I will," said Pat. Colonel Forbes was delighted. "She's just the dog for me," he said. "Bring her round on Monday and we'll make a start with her." So it was all settled. But Pat and Sarah and Julian were sad. They would miss Bess far more than they had missed the hamster and the mice. As Pat said, for all her faults, she's a loving creature. But I can't be having the post late whilst I'm chasing all over Greendale to find her when she takes it into her head to wander off. Silly lass. Monday came. Julian looked tearful as he said goodbye to Bess. "Don't take on," said Pat. "You'll be able to go round to the Colonel's to see her any time you like."
"I know," said Julian, but he still looked tearful.
Pat had delivered all his letters, and it was time to take Bess to Colonel Forbes. Pat drove along with Bess by his side. He felt tearful himself. Just as they were passing Alf Thompson's bottom meadow, Bess began to make a fuss. "Oh, you don't want to get out, do you?" said Pat, "just when we're a bit late." But Bess did want to get out. She barked and whined until Pat stopped the van. "Well, be quick then," said Pat. Bess jumped out, but she still whined at Pat. "Oh, what is it now?" said Pat in a cross voice. She wanted him to get out and look. Pat came. Bess led him to a cardboard box stuck in the hedge. She sniffed and whined and wagged her tail. She nosed at the box. "What is it, Bess?" said Pat. Pat lifted the lid of the box. "Well, I'll be blessed," said Pat. "How did you know that was there?" Curled up in the bottom of the box was a little black and white kitten. Pat picked it up gently, and it opened its eyes and meowed at him. "Poor little thing," said Pat. "Who can have left you there?" Bess gave it a kiss with her long wet tongue that made it sneeze. "Good girl," said Pat. And this is how Pat arrived home that day, without Bess, but with a kitten tucked up in his warm coat.
"Let's call it Jess," said Julian.
And they did. They all loved Jess. He didn't run away or chase hens or chew holes in the floor or make people scream in the bus. He has ridden in the van every day with Pat from that day to this. Pat says He's grand company, is our Jess. As for Bess, she became a very good sheepdog. She loves nothing better than a good day out working the sheep on the fells. And the shepherd often brings her to see Pat and Sarah and Julian and her old friend Jess.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat, and his black and white cat.
Postman Pat's Market Day. Pat was looking through the Pencaster Gazette. On the back page there was a big advertisement that said, Pencaster Auction Market Limited. Annual prize show and sale, Saturday the 20th of September at 10:30 a.m. All classes of sheep, cattle and poultry, goats and pigs. Look at that, said Pat. It's years and years since I went to market. I do love a good sale. And it's a show as well.
Why don't you go? Said Mrs. Goggins, looking over his shoulder.
It starts at 10:30, said Pat. I'll be busy with my letters.
Oh, it'll go on all day, with all that to sell. You'll not miss much, said Mrs. Goggins. I've seen Herbert Pottage coming back from a big sale at 6 and 7 o'clock.
I bet young Julian would like it, said Pat. He's never been to market. That Saturday the letters were sorted and delivered in record time. Pat and Sarah and Julian caught the Greendale bus at 12:30. Miss Hubbard was driving, and she had 4 large baskets on the luggage rack with lids on them. Pat puzzled about those baskets all the way to Pencaster. They looked like cat baskets, but Pat knew that Miss Hubbard didn't have any cats, let alone 4. He meant to ask her, but the bus was soon full, and she was too busy for conversation. When they got to Pencaster, they had beans on toast at Mosscrop's Cafe. Then Pat said, We'll be off to market then.
I haven't time for the market, said Sarah. Somebody has to do the shopping, you know.
We'd better come and help, said Pat.
No, it's all right, said Sarah. There isn't all that much shopping, and I want to pick a new pair of shoes in peace. I can manage. We'll meet for a cup of tea at 4, in time for the 5 o'clock bus.
It was a long walk to the market. It was on the edge of town, where there was plenty of room for all the trucks and trailers that brought the cows and sheep and goats and pigs to the market. There was a big car park too, and it was filled with the farmers' cars and Land Rovers and vans and tractors and horse boxes. There were pens for the animals waiting to be sold, and there was a field at the back, full of noisy bullocks. Even though the sale had been on for almost 3 hours, new wagons full of sheep and cattle were still driving up. Others were being loaded up with animals that had been sold. There was the bleating and mooing and the grunting and squealing of pigs. There was the shouting of farmers and their men as they drove the cattle into the pens. And the market had its special mixture of smells. Animals and petrol, and concrete floors washed with disinfectant.
What a pong, said Julian.
And what a noise, said Pat. I'd forgotten what it's like. There were crowds of farmers and their wives inside and outside. Some were looking at the lists of animals for sale. Some were going round the pens having a good look at a sow or a goat they might fancy. Some were shaking hands on a deal. Some were counting out rolls of £10 notes. Some were just having a good chat with friends and relations. Pat and Julian had to push and squeeze their way in, past all this busyness. At last they found a corner where they could see all that was going on inside the market. There was a space in the middle, a bit like a circus ring, where the animals were brought to be sold. There were passages and gates leading into it. All round the ring were galleries where the people stood. Above the ring there was a special box that made Julian think of the pulpit in church where the Reverend Tim stood on Sundays. But the Reverend was not in it. Instead, there was the most important man at the market, the auctioneer. He stood up there at a little desk with a wooden hammer in his hand and looked down on everybody. He announced each animal as it came into the ring, in a voice that rang round that noisy place so clear and loud that everyone heard him. He said who was selling it, how heavy it was, and how old it was. Then he banged his hammer on the desk, looked around at everyone and said, "Come along now, ladies and gentlemen, who'll start us off? What am I bid? Shall I say 160? Who'll give me 160? 160? Thank you, sir. 160. 70? 80? 80? 85? 85? 85? Who'll say 90? £190 for this fine sow. 90? Thank you, madam. 95? 95? 200? Yes, yes, thank you. 200. 200? Any more bids? 200? Will anyone say 210? No? 200? Is that your best bid, ladies and gentlemen? Going at 200 to the lady over there. Going for the first time? Bang with the hammer. Going for the second time? Another bang with the hammer. Going for the third time? And a final bang with the hammer and a word in his ear from one of the helpers. Sold to Mrs. Cowan at £200. And next, and off he was again. Julian was in a muddle. How did the auctioneer know that Mrs. Cowan wanted that pig? She hadn't said anything at all. All she had done was to nod and smile. Julian thought it was a funny way to spend £200. Some people seemed to give the auctioneer a little wave when they wanted to buy something, or just touch the cap or hat. The auctioneer seemed to muddle the numbers up too. He went faster and faster. Sometimes when a lot of people wanted something, he got into a high-speed gabble and Julian couldn't tell a word he said. "Look," said Pat, "there's Miss Hubbard in her new hat. She's come to the market between bus trips. Give her a wave." "Hello, hello, Miss Hubbard," Pat waved, and the auctioneer said, "Thank you, sir, 150 and 200 over there." But Pat was so busy admiring Miss Hubbard's hat that he didn't seem to notice what the auctioneer was saying.
"Dad," said Julian, "I think—"
But the auctioneer was off again, and Pat couldn't hear Julian. Then Pat spotted Mr. and Mrs. Pottage and the twins. "Hello," he called, waving and smiling across at them. 65, said the auctioneer, and 70 to the lady over there.
"Dad," said Julian.
But Pat had seen Alf Thompson. "He must have come to buy some lambs," said Pat. "Alf! Alf, hello there!" And he waved to Alf. 50, said the auctioneer, and a bargain at the price. Any more bids? Going, gone at £50 to the gentleman with the blue scarf.
"That's you, Dad," said Julian.
"What?" said Pat.
"You've bought a goat. You're the man in the blue scarf.
A goat? Said Pat. I haven't bought anything.
You were waving at Alf, and that auctioneer man thought you were waving to say you wanted to buy that goat.
A goat? Said Pat. Oh dear. How much was it?
£50, said Julian. That's what he said.
Oh dear, said Pat. What a muddle. Whatever shall we do?
It's a very nice goat, said Julian.
It might well be a very nice goat. But what are we going to do with a goat? Said Pat.
We could milk it, said Julian. I love goat's milk and so does Mum.
Does she? Said Pat.
Yes, said Julian. And it would keep the grass short in the garden. It'd save you having to cut it.
It'll keep the flowers short as well, said Pat. By now the auctioneer's helpers had come to take Pat's address, and one of them was saying, "Could you collect by 6 p.m, sir? Pen number 23. Yes, said Pat. And take this slip to the office with your payment. Thank you, said Pat. So this is how Pat and Julian came to be walking through the middle of Pencaster on a Saturday afternoon with a very lively goat, using a length of binder twine as a lead. A frisky goat in an empty field is bad enough. In the middle of Pencaster, it was something that Pat would never ever forget. He never knew how they managed to get to the tea shop where they were meeting Sarah. The goat was surprisingly strong. It pulled Pat this way and that way, any way except the way he wanted to go. It tried to butt people. It went nosing under market stalls to nibble at dropped vegetables and fruit. It tried to get into a supermarket. It wrapped its lead round people's legs. It wanted to fight dogs and cats. It tried to climb the steps of a fire escape and dragged Pat halfway up. It knocked over boxes of apples. What a time Pat had getting that goat through the busy Pencaster streets. And when Sarah saw it, she nearly had a fit.
What in the world are you doing with a goat? She said. We've bought it, said Julian. Bought it?
Well, it was an accident, actually, said Pat.
An accident? How can you... He nodded, said Julian. Nodded? And waved? No, he did. And the man thought... Which man? Said Sarah. The auctioneer man. Oh, yes. He thought Dad wanted to buy the goat. He said it was a bargain, and it is. Some of them were much more... Oh, said Sarah. Were they? And how much was this one? And what in the world are we going to do with a goat? And where are we going to keep it? We could milk it, said Julian. Goat's milk, delicious. I love goat's milk, said Sarah.
And we could keep it in the garden, said Pat.
It'll eat the flowers. But we could fence a bit of grass off for it, or even put it in Alf's field. I'm sure he wouldn't mind, especially if we gave them some of the milk. You tether them to a post.
Brilliant, said Pat.
How much did you say it was? Said Sarah.
We didn't, said Pat. It was £50.
50?
Yep.
Oh. We could make cheese and sell it to the visitors in summer, said Julian. That's a good idea, said Sarah. But it'll take a long time to earn £50. Oh, well, it's done now, so we'll have to make the best of it.
Yes, I suppose we will, said Pat.
How are we going to get it home? Said Sarah.
I was wondering about that, said Pat.
We could put it on the bus, in the luggage space under the stairs. A goat on a bus? I don't think Miss Hubbard would be too pleased about that. What if it eats one of those lovely seat covers? Goats eat all kinds of things, you know.
But when the bus came, it was quite full, and the luggage space under the stairs was already filled with Miss Hubbard's 4 baskets, which were now filled with clucking hens. They could see at once that it wouldn't do to squeeze a goat in next to 4 baskets of hens. Not this goat, anyway. "You get on the bus," said Pat, "and I'll walk the goat home."
Do you know how far it is? Said Sarah. I think you'll end up with the goat carrying you.
There seemed to be no other way of getting that goat home. So Pat set out along the road with the goat trotting alongside him. Sarah and Julian waved to him as they went by in the bus. Poor Pat. It was not easy walking with that goat. It was almost as bad in the country as it was in the town. Whenever there was a side road, the goat wanted to go up it. Whenever there were sheep or cows in the fields, the goat wanted to be over the wall to go and play with them. Pat got along very slowly to Greendale. What a lucky thing it was that Alf Thompson came along in his Land Rover. Lucky, too, that Alf had sold one of his pigs at the market. This meant that the back of the Land Rover was empty. Alf stopped to pick Pat up as soon as he saw him. They had a struggle to get that goat in, but they did it in the end, and were soon bowling along the road home. "My goodness," said Pat, "I was glad to see you. I was getting really tired of walking with that creature. There was so much to and fro and here and there with it that it was twice as far." Pat got the goat home in the end, and Ted brought some fencing wire round and helped him to make it a paddock at the end of the garden. Soon all Greendale knew the story of Pat's goat. Peter Fogg turned up that night with an old hen hut on the trailer. "We're not using this," he said, "and it'll make a snug home for your goat. It'll need somewhere warm to sleep at night." When summer came round again, Sarah put a notice on the gate. "Goat's milk for sale." Pat made another trip to the market. This time Alf went with him, with the Land Rover, and Pat nodded at the auctioneer on purpose. They came back with a billy goat, and if you go there next summer and buy some milk, you might see some baby goats running and playing in Pat's garden or in the field next door.
Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. Early in the morning, just as day is dawning, he picks up all the post bags in his van. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat. All the birds are singing and the day is just beginning. Pat feels he's a really happy man. Everybody knows his bright red van. All his friends will smile as he waves to greet them. Maybe you can never be sure there'll be knock, ring, letters through your door. Letters through your door. Postman Pat, Postman Pat, Postman Pat and his black and white cat.